From the Oregon State University Extension Service, this is Pollination, a podcast that tells the stories of researchers, land managers, and concerned citizens making bold strides to improve the health of pollinators. I'm your host, Dr. Adoni Melathopoulos, Assistant Professor in Pollinator Health in the Department of Horticulture. When we think about how humans interact with bees, our mind almost invariably travels to honeybees. You can think back to a past episode we had with Spencer Leonard talking about a book from the 1800s called The Fable of the Bees, where transformations in society are conceptualized through a honeybee colony. But there is a long history of human interaction with other bees, and that's where my next guest comes in. Dana Church has recently authored a new book called The Beekeepers: How Humans Changed the World of Bumblebees. So in this episode, we're going to talk with Dr. Church about her book and what this history is with bumblebees and humanity. And also this book has, although it's very readable for any audience, it was really directed towards a youth audience. So we're going to finish off the episode by hearing how you could use this book and incorporate it into your classroom or, if you're a parent talking with your kids about bees. So this week on Pollination, we're going to look at the other beekeepers, humanity's interactions with bumblebees. All right, well, welcome to Pollination.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I'm really happy you're here too. I was really intrigued by the title of your new book. As a peculiar title for a book about bumblebees, The Beekeepers. What was the impetus for a book about human influences on bumblebees?
Well, I'll just go back a little bit. So I studied bumblebees for my PhD at the University of Ottawa in Canada. And even though I was pursuing a more academic career, I always wanted to write a book. And for some strange reason that I don't know why, I always wanted to write for kids. It just comes naturally to me. And I decided one day, I'm going to try writing a book about bees because I know a lot about bees. And I noticed in the children's market for books, there's a lot of books out there about honeybees, and the public knows about honeybees. They're usually the first bee that comes to mind when you mention bees, but there's not a lot out there on bumblebees. So I thought, well, I'm going to write about my experience working with bumblebees. So the book actually started out as a nonfiction for kids, but it had a fictional character whose mother was a professor and had a bee lab, and she would sort of show the reader around the bee lab and talk about bees, give facts about bees, or bumblebees, I should say. So that's what I pitched to the publishers, this fictional story, or this nonfiction with a fictional character. And one editor came back, my editor at Scholastic, and she said, this is very interesting, but what about a book about the human interaction or the human relationship with bees? And I thought, oh, that's really interesting. Let me think about that. So I went away and I started to do a bit of research because my background, I studied animal cognition. So I looked at spatial memory in bumblebees. So I was looking at a very specific aspect of bumblebees. So I didn't know too much about the human interaction with bumblebees at the time, but I soon discovered that there was a lot to write about. So I went back to her and I said, sure, I would love to write this book. So yeah, it ended up being a book about how humans have influenced bumblebees, in terms of where they are found in the world, our impact on their population and distribution. And the title actually, we went back and forth on the title a number of times. And I know that the beekeepers, when you think of the beekeepers, probably think of honey beekeeping, but to me, the title, The Beekeepers, sort of symbolizes how humans have also been sort of keeping bumblebees as well, whether we are aware of it or not. On the one hand, as I go on to talk about in my book, there's habitat loss and pesticides and human influence on bees, which influence them. But also there's a huge industry for commercial bumblebees. These companies that, ship out millions and millions of bumblebee colonies to greenhouses and crops to be pollinated. So in a big sense, we are sort of the keepers of the bumblebees as well.
That's fantastic. You have to do a double take. I was thinking, yeah, there are a lot of children's books on honeybees. And you see this, the beekeepers, and you're like, I see bumblebees there. And so, it really does prompt you to think about this history of how humans may have influenced bees. And maybe you can give us some examples. I mean, in the book, it's not just this recent domestication. It goes back a ways. Tell us a little bit about sort of this early relationship between humans and bumblebees.
Sure. So in my book, I talk a bit about how bumblebees ended up in certain parts of the world, either by accident, we think, to the best of our knowledge, or they've actually been imported. So, for instance, in Iceland, there's bumblebees in Iceland, and it's thought that they arrived there by accident, that they arrived through Viking ships that were traveling across the waters. And somehow a bumblebee might have, just managed to hitchhike on a Viking ship. And then when they arrived in Iceland, it flew off and found a home. And, I guess it was a queen that was ready to lay eggs, and she established a nest, and there you have it. At least that's our best understanding of how bees might have ended up on Iceland. But also bees were imported hundreds of years ago, as far as we know, to pollinate red clover. So they were taken from, I believe it was the UK was it New Zealand? To pollinate red clover. They needed lots of red clover to feed the horses at the time, to pull their carts. There weren't cars at the time. So they were actually intentionally imported over. And over time, they perfected the technique of bringing over bees that were actually in hibernation, and so that when they woke up, they would be in their new continent. So humans have played a deliberate hand in distributing bees around the world. And these days, or more recently, I should say, they're sent around the world, like I mentioned, from these commercial companies who, greenhouses or farmers can order these bees, and they're shipped to their greenhouse or their cropland to pollinate crops. So that's another way that bees have been distributed also, because these bees can escape from greenhouses that they're sent to, and especially if they're out in the open for crops, they can go off and establish their own nests, and then start establishing populations in areas where they weren't found before. So that's just some examples.
I know some bees are notorious for hitchhiking. Anything in the family Megachilidae has sort of been spread hither. But bumblebees, it sounds like, in some ways, need humans to move them. Like, I was thinking about this. Who knows? Maybe in a bale of hay, the Vikings, brought them to Iceland. But the biology of moving bumblebees, is it easy to move bumblebees and bring them to a new area? At least back then, when people were moving them on ships, not like today, where they get put on an airplane. And are bumblebees well adapted? Is it a tricky thing to do?
Good question. Well, what I was able to find out through my research was that at the beginning, they weren't very successful in transporting bees, especially from continent to continent, where they had to go by ships, and it would take a long time. Often many, if not all, of the bees end up dying. They were in hibernation mode, but just the conditions weren't good enough. But then once ships started to have refrigeration, then it seems like it was a lot easier, or at least the success rate was a lot better, because they were able to chill the bees, I guess, in a state where they were, I guess, in hibernation mode for the duration of the trip, and then they could I guess, let them thaw out, for lack of a better term, in their new home, and then they could establish their nests. So it seems like refrigeration units played a role. And also nowadays with the commercial companies, it seems as though they have a good handle on how to control when queens go into hibernation and when they emerge. Although as much digging as I did, I couldn't find out their trade secrets. So
those trade secrets, they're very hard to. It's funny because in the honeybee beekeeping world, all the secrets are out. Like they were all a product of the 19th century and sort of
right.
but bumblebees, man, finding out how they do things is very hard.
Yeah. Yeah, it was very tricky. Yeah, the commercial companies keep their data close to their chests. I tried and poked and prodded, but yeah, and even in terms of the numbers of colonies that they export every year, it's hard to get a good number on that. But from what I could find, and this was data from a few years ago, it was in the millions each year that they were shipping out these boxes of bumblebees.
Well, going back to the 19th century, there is this intense interest in bumblebees that is not only how do we, pollinate red clover so that we can get things transported, but about their biology. Can you just tell us a little bit about that explosion of interest? And I guess this, in part, in the book, take the form of, a very, famous evolutionary biologist, maybe the most famous, taking interest in bumblebees. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Sure, yeah. So two naturalists or two, I guess, scientists, you could call them, that I
know
feature in my book.
In that period, it's hard to tell. Like people are not credentialed. They just kind of like take it up.
I know. Yes. That's why I hesitated. I'm like, are they naturalists or scientists? I'll call them scientists, whatever. So yes, I feature Darwin and also a gentleman named Frederick William Lambert Sladen. So those are two that I feature. And yeah, Sladen actually, he wrote a very comprehensive book on bumblebees and how to raise bumblebees. He would actually catch queen bees in the spring and he would make these, I think they were made out of wood, these wooden domiciles or boxes, and he would raise the colonies. And it's a very readable book, very entertaining at times because he actually kept nests of bees or colonies of bees in his office, and he would apparently keep his window open so the bees could fly outside and forage and come back. So yeah, and why was he interested in bees or bumblebees? I'm not exactly sure. I don't think he actually, off the top of my head, I can't remember if he actually said it, but thinking of naturalists and scientists back then, these are big fuzzy insects and they're sort of, as their name implies, bumbling around or look like they're bumbling around. And so I think it was probably really interesting for people back then to see these big fuzzy insects flying around. And I'm guessing too that they were probably way more abundant than they are now. So especially if somebody had a garden, they would probably see a ton of these bees and just be curious as to what they are. Because I guess during that time too, like now, people mostly think of honeybees and they keep honeybees, but bumblebees were less well known. And Darwin, the story I was able to find with Darwin is that it was actually his son who found these bumblebees buzzing around in their backyard. And he told his dad, Darwin, about them, and they decided to study them together. So Darwin, with his son, and then I think he recruited his other children, they would observe bumblebees on their property. And Darwin wrote about them a bit. And it was interesting. One way that they were able to track them is they would sprinkle flour on the bees so they could see these bees flying around. So very, very interesting. But yeah, I think it's just these big, beautiful, fuzzy insects, and not knowing much about them at the time, people were probably very interested in them.
And in the book, there's some great illustrations from the Sladen book, just the various ways of trying to see how you could get the bees to nest in one, because that's still a problem today. Is it's easy to watch bumblebees as they're on flowers, but to understand anything about their nesting behavior is tricky.
Right. Yeah. And I touch on that later in my book too, because we're still trying to figure out, where do bumblebees establish their nest? For the most part, it's underground, as far as we know, in old rats or vole nests, or any little crevices underground or hidden. So because they're hidden and because they're underground, it's very hard for us to find nests unless you see bees zipping in and out. Like I found a bumblebee nest underneath my shed one summer, and it was simply because I saw bees going in and out. Otherwise, I would never have found it. You can't visibly see a bumblebee nest very well. So
Well, let's take a break. I want to fast forward to the present, and also just want to, for educators who are listening, just maybe talk a little bit about, how the book might, fit into their curricula, or, people are looking for books for their kids. Let's take a quick break, and we'll come back, and looking forward to talking more about the beekeepers.
great. Thank you.
Okay, we're back now. Thanks for that, deep history of bumblebees and humans, going back to the Vikings, if not further back in the book. Now, let's fast forward to the present, and there's been this renewed interest in bumblebee beekeeping that's been associated with crops that have these funny anthers, where the flowers, the pollen is not available to bees on the outside. They've got to kind of shake the flower. Can you tell us about this aspect of bumblebee beekeeping?
Sure. So, yeah, what you're talking about is buzz pollination. And I talk about that in my book because I have a chapter about how bumblebees can be considered superstar pollinators. Because not only are they big and fuzzy, which helps them stay out when it's cooler compared to other bees, but they're able to pollinate these flowers where the pollen is rather hidden inside the anthers, and the anthers have to be vibrated. So what the bumblebees do, and other species of bees too, but bumblebees especially, they curl around the anthers. So they sort of hang upside down, and they grab the anthers with their mouth parts and their legs, and they shake their flight muscles really, really fast. And when they do that, you can hear a high pitched buzz, like a bzzzt sound. And it sounds different from when they're flying around. So if you happen to see tomato flowers or blueberry flowers and there's bees around, if you're able to, just stop and listen for a while and watch, and you might see a bumblebee buzz pollinate one of these blossoms. And it's quite interesting because you can hear the distinctive high-pitched buzz that they make. But yeah, so they hang on, they shake their flight muscles, and what happens is it's kind of like shaking a tree to get the apples down. So it shakes the anthers, the pollen comes out, and it lands on their belly.
Oh, so like the vibrations going up the trunk of the tree, and then everything falls
Yeah,
off.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, making the apples fall. So the pollen comes out, falls on the bee's belly, and then she scrapes the pollen grains back to her back legs, and then goes about her way. But yeah, so plants that need buzz pollination are tomatoes, blueberries, cranberries, quite popular crops. So, and honeybees, as far as I know, don't buzz pollinate these types of flowers. So that's why bumblebees are the ones that are used to pollinate tomatoes. And it's a huge industry. That's where most of these commercial bumblebee colonies are shipped to, or our greenhouses. And when you think about it, we use tomatoes in so many things. Not only do we eat tomatoes on their own, but ketchup, pizza sauce, pasta sauce. We all need tomatoes, and bumblebees are the ones that pollinate those. And as I talk about in my book, people can pollinate tomato flowers. Like you can get these like handheld contraptions that look sort of like electric toothbrushes, but you have to go around and buzz every flower, and that can get quite expensive when you're paying employees to do that. So with bumblebees, it's much more efficient and much more natural to use them as pollinators.
I remember seeing this for the first time when I was, doing my master's work in the Fraser Valley. Suddenly, bumblebees started to appear. And I remember they tried honeybee colonies, and obviously, as honeybees don't buzz pollinate, and it never worked, and they just didn't like greenhouses. But bumblebees seem to like not mind like they can reproduce and fly around a greenhouse, which is a remarkable thing. It's like it's a pretty artificial environment, and they
Yes.
can
Yeah.
pollinate all these plants.
Yeah. It's quite incredible. Yeah.
And I have noticed, I guess the second part of my life when I did go to when I went to Atlantic Canada is the first time I saw bumblebee colonies being used in an outdoor situation on low bush blueberry, where they would bring in, they would have honeybees, but they'd also, just to get that added bump, there was all sorts of ideas of maybe they kind of fly differently or loosen the pollen for the honeybees. But that this is something that, and now recently I've heard, expansions of, on the West Coast. So in Oregon, we can't import a bumblebee that's not native to the state. I think we're one of the few, for listeners out there, just to be conscious of that. But one of the companies has now domesticated one of the natives for this area. So um, it is an industry that just keeps growing.
Right. Yeah. And I talk a bit about that in my book too, about commercializing native versus imported bees, because yeah, one issue that comes up with all these commercial colonies is that Bombus impatiens, the common eastern bumblebee in North America, is a popular one, but it's been shipped to areas where there's other native bees in the area, and they seem to be taking what they escape from greenhouses, and they seem to be expanding their range, whereas the native species are declining. And we're not sure exactly why, whether it is disease that these imported bees have brought, because whenever you have animals in factory-like conditions, there's always chance for disease, and there's lots of evidence that these commercial colonies can transmit diseases if they're not monitored carefully. And then, these new bees coming in can take over habitat, take over nesting sites. So yeah, it's important, I think, to consider, if bumblebees are going to be commercialized, to commercialize the native bees in the area rather than importing new species. The one, I guess, drastic story that I came across was in Argentina and Chile. They have this huge rusty colored bumblebee called Bombus dalbami. It's a beautiful bee, but it's in great decline. And they think it's because there's been great importing of Bombus, I think it's Bombus impatiens, to pollinate greenhouses, for plants in greenhouses. And these bees have escaped, and the Bombus impatiens population is increasing, whereas the Bombus dalbami native population is decreasing. So it'd be a complete shame if this beautiful big rusty colored bumblebee becomes extinct. So
It's like the only, if I remember right, it's the only native species in that area. Like it's not like the
yeah.
Pacific Northwest where there's dozens of species, but it's like there's one species and it's in having trouble.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Yeah. So
Well, it might be good just to remind, for listeners who don't know, with Bombus impatiens, it isn't native in Oregon, but there is a population that is thought to escape from the greenhouses in British Columbia. That is, I think, in the Mount
mhm.
Vernon area now. The Washington State Department of Agriculture has been doing has a great citizen science project to track its movement. But fortunately, at this point, I think it's only in northern Washington. But I'm glad that you
Right.
raised these issues, because this is, I imagine, for um, students who are thinking about bumblebees for the very first time in their lives, are fascinated by them. But I guess the book kind of draws them deeper into thinking about, the implications of, this interaction between humans and bumblebees. There's some, remarkable stories, but there's some stories where, we're starting to see bumblebee range declines maybe associated with human interactions. I guess I want to ask you, what do you, maybe this goes beyond the book, but what do you see as the future of this interaction? How could it play out in maybe more positive ways or negative ways?
Oh, that's a really good question. Because although, I mentioned, it's probably best to commercialize native species. When you get into areas where there's a number of native species, like I'm thinking of Ontario, where I'm from, for example, there's a number of different bumblebee species. And even though Bombus impatiens is native to Ontario, there's all kinds of other species out there of bumblebees. Rusty patched is a good example where the rusty patched population has just plummeted in Ontario. They're finding it again in Minnesota and in other areas. But so yes, Bombus impatiens is native to Ontario, and commercializing it, sure, but it could also squeeze out other species that also exist. So, in terms of how it plays out in the future, it's a really good question. What I've been seeing so far is that it's a mystery why some of these species, bumblebee species, are hardier than others. Like Bombus impatiens, just seems to be really good at adapting to greenhouses, like you said, and also just surviving in the wild. They seem to be taking over a lot of habitat, whereas other species are declining. So maybe, for some reason, they're just not quite as adaptable as impatiens. You get the similar over in Europe where you have Bombus terrestris, the buff-tailed bumblebee, which is commercialized and is very good at surviving in all kinds of different areas, whereas other native species are having trouble. So I see, maybe these more hardier species, increasing in population or maybe stabilizing, and whereas other species, unfortunately, might be really declining. And I hope not, but there's a potential that they could die out. Franklin's is a great example. Franklin's bumblebee. We haven't seen that bumblebee species in years, and we're still looking for it, but whereas other species are just doing fine. So it's a really interesting question, and I hope that no bee species go extinct, but it's really hard to say. Things don't look very good for some species.
Well, I think this is a lot of information. It's a great and rich book, and I do. What grades would you say the book is kind of steered towards? And if I was a parent or an educator and I wanted to incorporate the book into how could you use this book in a classroom, let's say?
Sure. So the book is technically aimed at ages 8 to 12, but I've had many adults read it and they said they've enjoyed it and it's very readable. So I've done a number of class visits with, grades 3 to grade 6. So again, that age 8 to 12 range. And teachers are really interested in incorporating it into units on the ecosystem and biodiversity, because bees generally don't immediately come to mind when we think of, biodiversity and that kind of thing. Usually it's the big mammals and humans too, but bees usually aren't on people's radar. So yeah, when I talk to classes, I talk to them about why bees are important for the environment, all the different types of species of bumblebees that are out there. They often think of them as just black and yellow, big fuzzy bees, but there's bumblebees of all kinds of different colors and species. And also, too, I take the opportunity in these class visits to let students know why I'm interested in studying bees, because a lot of kids, and myself included, I didn't always love bees. I was scared of them as a kid. I always thought they were going to sting me until I got my summer job working with them. And then I realized, yeah, they're not out to sting us. We can watch them and they're fascinating and they're too busy going about their own business to sting us. So when I let kids know that bumblebees are not bloodthirsty stingers, they really open up and they're like, and they can see that, yeah, bees maybe aren't as scary as they thought they were. And yeah, that they're very important to the ecosystem. So hopefully to make kids a little less scared of them, and that, they're not these big animals that they usually think of when they think of the environment and helping the environment. But thankfully, bees are getting more of the spotlight for sure in environmental movements and environmental organizations. But yeah, so I talked to them about ecosystems, biodiversity, and just how bumblebees are just really fascinating if you take the time to watch them.
Well, and I think that's one thing that educators who may haven't thought about incorporating, bumblebees or other wild bees into their curriculum is that they're really observable. If you have a school garden or anything like that, you can, you know, create lesson plans associated with them. They're really easy to, go beyond just, a slideshow. You can actually see them. But the thing I think is really remarkable about your book is it braids things together. It's not merely a bee biology book, but as your publisher has prompted you, it kind of gets people to think a little bit about interactions in a way that I
Mhm.
think is really wonderful and rarely done. Like I think that kind of that you get a history, human interaction, and biology. Um, Primer all in one, easy read is wonderful.
Oh, well, thank you so much. Yeah. And it's funny. It just came across or came about organically as I was writing. As I was writing this, I was like, yeah, this really feels like I'm trying to be an advocate for bees and to show that we are having an impact on them, besides just bee behavior and bee biology. There is some of that in the book too, but I hope to really get across that we are influencing the existence of bumblebees, but there's also lots we can do to help them as well. And I give lots of different examples. And for my next book, actually, my next book is on monarch butterflies. And I try to do
Oh,
the same thing. I try to show that people have been living with monarch butterflies for so long, but we're having quite an impact on them. And at the same time, though, there's lots that we can do to help them, and we're still learning about them, and they're fascinating. And yeah.
I'm looking for. We will have you back on when you have
Oh,
that book out.
thank
And
you. Yeah.
let's take a quick break, though. We have 3 questions we ask our guests. I'm curious. We had a book author. I don't know if we had. So this is a new edition. I'm so curious what your answers are going to be. All
Okay.
right, we are back. We've got 3 questions for you. The first one is, as an author, do you have a book recommendation?
Oh, yes, I do. One of my favorite books that I came across when I was doing research for my own book is it's a book for adults. It's called A Sting in the Tail by Dave Goulson.
Oh, it's a great book.
I say it's for adults, but kids could read it too. So A Sting in the Tail by Dave Goulson. He is a bumblebee researcher in the UK, and he wrote this book all about it's called My Adventures with Bumblebees. And it's very accessible, very entertaining. He has a great sense of humor, but it's just packed with all kinds of information about bumblebees. And he presents it in a very entertaining way. He also wrote a book called Bee Quest, also about bumblebees. I think that one is more about the decline of bumblebees, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, Sting in the Tail is one of my favorites.
It's great. It's I was thinking, it's biographical, and there's you get to see his childhood, and I was hoping in a book like yours, somebody reads it and it's like, well, yeah, Sladen, I'm going to go do that.
Yeah, yeah. Oh, I hope so too. I hope so too. I hope it sparks a whole new generation of bee researchers.
I'm confident of that. Well, speaking of bee research or authorship, we go-to tool you do a lot of work with bees, right? From research to writing. Do you have a tool that you find indispensable in that work?
One tool that I actually promote in my book and that I really love is bumblebeewatch.org.
Oh yeah.
So it's an app that you can get that can help you identify bumblebees, and the public can use it, and if they see a bee out in nature or out in their backyard, they can take a picture of it and send it to bumblebeewatch.org. And it helps scientists keep track of the various species of bumblebees that are out there. So it's a citizen science initiative, and I think it's great.
Well, and to that end, for listeners in the Pacific Northwest, we're lucky to have Bumblebee Watch has sort of been amped up into the Pacific Northwest Bumblebee Atlas, which is their Sea Society also. So if you're interested in this, if you read the book and you're like, man, I want to contribute to Bumblebee knowledge, it's a great initiative, and we'll have it in the show notes so you too can participate, because it's bumblebees. I think that the way that you described it with early Victorian naturalists is, they're big enough to kind of like photograph and see. It's like, it's a great way to get yourself into melitology for sure.
Yeah, and you mentioned the atlases. I'm so happy to hear that bumblebee atlases are starting to be established in various different states. It's wonderful. I hope Canada follows suit. Maybe they are. I don't know, but yeah, all these different bumblebee atlases will be so useful.
Well, speaking of which, and I've been always surprised by this answer. I've had honeybee beekeepers who list some kind of obscure native bee to obscure native bee people listing, suggesting a butterfly. So what's your favorite pollinating insect?
Oh, pollinating insect. Oh, that's a tough one. I would have to say, I love that Bombus dalbami, the big rusty colored bumblebee in Argentina and Chile. I hope to see it one day in real life. Yeah, it's just, I can't imagine. It's just apparently so huge and so fluffy. And I interviewed Dr. Amy Toth from Iowa State. She's been down to Argentina to study it. And just hearing her describe it, she's like, it's these big orange furry buses that are just buzzing through the air. And I think, yeah, it would be a marvel to see. So I think that one would have to be my favorite, although it's very hard to choose. Just the other day, I think on Twitter, I saw a new, or what we think is a new bumblebee species out in China. It was like, it had white and orange and yellow stripes. It was just gorgeous. I don't think it has a name yet, but there's just all these different bee species that maybe we haven't even found yet either. So yeah, all these different bumblebee fur patterns are just amazing. So
I know it's a tough question, and I do take a slight pleasure in watching people squirm when there's so many bees to choose from.
Yeah, but after writing a book on monarch butterflies, I have to say monarch butterflies are way up there. Yeah, I love them. Yeah, they're great.
Well, thank you so much. We're looking forward to catching up with you on your next book. Thanks for taking time to talk about your book. I've read it. It's really wonderful. I really encourage all the rest of you to pick it up.
Oh, thank you so much. It's been so fun to be on your show.
Thank you so much for listening. The show is produced by Quinn Sinan Neal, who's a student here at OSU in the New Media Communications program, and the show wouldn't even be possible without the support of the Oregon Legislature, the Foundation for Food and Agricultural Research, and Western SARE. Show notes with links mentioned on each episode are available on the website, which is at pollinationpodcast.oregonstate.edu. I also love hearing from you, and there's several ways to connect with me. The first one is you can visit the website and leave an episode-specific comment. You can suggest a future guest or topic, or ask a question that could be featured in a future episode. But you can do the same things on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook by visiting the Oregon Bee Project. Thanks so much for listening, and see you next week.